Friends, these are desperate times. Desperate times. One's really lost for words. Your heart's broken because we're talking about friends whom we know, whom we've visited, whose coffee we've drunk. Going to Palestine was always dangerous. The opponents of Palestinians were right. The danger was the hospitality was overwhelming, and you weren't really ready to cope with it coming from Presbyterian Scotland. We have a reputation for not being overly generous. We've drunk their coffee. We've sat in their homes in Gaza, and now they're being killed. One man I know has lost 74 members of his extended family. And, it's not something new. It's been a long time coming. In 2014, a friend, actually, one of the members of the family lives in Sheffield and one in Scotland. And they lost 11 members of their family, 6 children, 1 and 5 adults. And they were killed by a smart bomb that fell on their home in Gaza. And the guidance system came from Raytheon in Fife, not too far up the road from Edinburgh. So the culpability is not something abstract. Britain is sending bombs and weapons to be dropped on Palestinians and to murder them. During the Great March of Return in 2018, there were peaceful demonstrations month after month, and snipers killed hundreds and hundreds and maimed thousands of Palestinians. And Britain sold sniper rifles to the Israeli military. And then we had them being interrogated softly on TV, and they're asked about this, and they say, well, Britain has a very robust program of making sure the weapons can't be used for human rights violations, blah, blah, blah. Utter lies, nonsense. And if there were a single investigative journalist left in Britain, in the mainstream media, they could easily rebut it. But journalism as we know it is dead in Britain. 125 Palestinian journalists are dead for doing their job. But journalism is dead here. It's a much bigger death. And it's so sick. Netanyahu marched in a demonstration in Paris a few years ago for freedom of speech and against attacks on journalists. He marched in the front row. Now, the other people marching with him, the leaders of the EU, they held their noses, but they let him march for freedom of speech and for safety for journalists whose regime has killed more journalists than anybody else. I first went to Palestine in 1987 and travelled up. I was teaching in the Middle East, travelled up to Palestine, Cairo, bus, Gaza, West Bank. It was easy then. And I was guided around Jerusalem by an Armenian Palestinian who took us around and showed us things that he thought we should know. And we went into a hospital, and there was a young woman lying on a bed with her parents on either side of her. And we were told that very morning, she was deaf. Her young brother had wandered out of the house, and she had wandered out to look for him. An Israeli patrol had shouted at her. She hadn't heard and had come back into the house. 2 soldiers held her down, and a 3rd soldier fired steel rubber-tipped bullets into her upper legs and shattered both upper legs. The man responsible for that policy, because it was a policy, it wasn't a bad apple, it wasn't something unusual, was called Yitzhak Rabin. And his policy at that time, he told the soldiers openly, break their legs. Temporarily, we don't want to kill too many, so break their legs. This photograph is soldiers holding down young Palestinian men. There's many of these photographs there, sometimes with rocks, sometimes with heavy staves. They break their arms by putting them on a rock and smashing their arm. That was the kind of barbarism that Palestinians have suffered for a very, very long time. It didn't happen. It didn't start on October the 7th. Palestinian history is punctuated with massacre after massacre after massacre. One could go back to 1948. I was talking to a man a few weeks ago, Ahmed, in a refugee camp in Syria, by phone, by Zoom. And he comes from the village of Ain al-Zaytun. He was a child when the massacre took place there. It's beside a town called Safed, which is actually quite famous in Palestine as a place of great Jewish and other religious learning. But Ain al-Zaytun is interesting only for one reason. Not because of the massacre. It's well documented. Mick Napier, in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, describes it. How the soldiers came in and started killing the young men. Then one captive said to the commanding officer, "Look, I'm a captive. I should be treated according to the Geneva Convention." He was told to find 37 young men at random, and they were shot dead. Because across the valley was the town of Safed, and it was to empty that town and terrorize the people there in order to leave. Now, this is all public domain. Israeli historians have told this story many times. What's interesting for me is that above that racist massacre, there is a JNF park. Have any of you heard of the JNF? The Jewish National Fund. Its patron, let's cut it short. The patron is Tony Blair, so you know it's pretty dirty. It's a pillar of Israeli apartheid, and over the decades, it has been the body which ensures that land passes from Palestinian to Jewish ownership and can never pass back again. So that even when a guilt-stricken Israeli wants to sell or give a Palestinian their home back again, it's illegal. It cannot be alienated back to the original owners. We are talking about, it's an insight into a state which B'Tselem, the biggest Israeli human rights organization, recently called, accurately, a Jewish supremacist state from the river to the sea. They followed on they preceded Amnesty, calling it an apartheid state, and I think also preceded Human Rights Watch, calling it an apartheid state, and UN bodies after UN bodies had reached that conclusion. So we went there, we saw this village, which had been where people had been massacred in 1948, and above the village now, there is a JNF park commemorating Martin Luther King. You've got a racist massacre. If you dig deep, you'll find teeth and hair. And on top of it is an anti-racist park named after an icon of anti-racism worldwide. You couldn't make it up. So this horror, and I won't belabor the horror, because if you don't know it, it's because you didn't want to know it, and we all know it. Today, this is the first genocide. It's not the first genocide Britain has been complicit in, not by a long chalk, but it's the first one we've seen on primetime TV and can watch on Al Jazeera week after week. And you can watch intelligent commentary on Al Jazeera, which is completely absent from the British mainstream media. What I wonder about, by the way, I don't wonder, I think I know. What I want to point out to you is the demonization of Palestinians. 20 years later, I've been to Palestine about 20 times. I'm barred now. Last time, me and 100 others were chucked in prison and chucked out. I went back 20 years later, 2007. Does anyone know this young child? Her name is Iman Al-Hams. And she's only of interest, apart from she was an intrinsically beautiful little child. I spoke to her father at some length in Gaza. Because in 2007, I think it was, the Palestinians blew a hole in the wall into Egypt. Just blew a huge hole with explosives. And hundreds of thousands surged out into Egypt to escape for a week or so. But I took the opportunity to go and speak to her father, Samir Al-Hams, and he's a primary school teacher in Rafah camp. I knew the story, but I wanted to speak to the father, and I made a terrible film. It was technically absolute rubbish, but it tells the story of Iman Al-Hams. And it serves to tell a much bigger story, and it's incontrovertible, it's irrefutable, because the conversations between the soldiers who killed her were recorded. and played on Israeli TV. And they're public. You can access them yourself. She was going to school one morning with her little satchel over her shoulder. She was 13, and she took a wrong turn. If you've been in, the Israelis sometimes use things called sound bombs. And I tell you, they scare the living daylights out of you. So anyway, the child took a wrong turn on the way to work. And the soldiers in the tower shot her in the leg, and she fell. The story was played on Israeli TV. And they shot her in the leg, and she fell wounded. And the officer went up to look at her, confirmed that she was wounded, and killed her with 2 shots to the head. In Israel, it's called confirming the kill. If you find a Palestinian wounded, then you usually kill him or her. That was played on Israeli TV. One soldier said to the other, "There's a little girl has wandered into the area. She looks terrified." And the officer said, "Kill her." And the soldier said, "She's terrified. It's just a school child." The officer said, "Kill everything in this area, even if it is 3 years old," quote unquote. Now, there was a furore. There was a bit of bad publicity around the world because this was played. This was, like people get caught on microphones saying things they shouldn't. It's an accident. It should never happen. This should never have been recorded, but it was played, and there was a brief international furore, and the officer was investigated for unethical conduct. He was found not guilty of unethical conduct. His conduct was ethical in the Israeli army. And then he sued the army for damages, and I think he was awarded about 20,000 quid for the trauma he went through by being investigated. That's the story of Iman al-Hams. It's only of interest because it was recorded. The killing of children is standard, it's routine. Can I have the next picture? This is Chris Hedges. We're in a church. He's a Presbyterian minister, but he's also a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Pulitzer Prize journalist. Sorry, I'll try again, I'll try English. A Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's been to all the world's war zones. And he wrote a very fine piece called Gaza Diary for Harper's Magazine. It's mainstream media in the USA. And in the Gaza Diary, he writes, "I've been to Algeria. I've seen women and children lined up and massacred. I've been to Guatemala. I've seen children slaughtered there. I've been to Yugoslavia. I've seen Serb snipers crumple children to the ground in Sarajevo. But Rafah was the only place I ever saw children killed for sport." And what he means is he saw it, and it's routine. Soldiers in the towers, bored. It's very boring sitting up in those towers and looking down on hungry, poor, imprisoned people. Sometimes they get bored and they shout through their public address system. I won't use the language in this church, but it's disgusting. Insults about their mother, the young boys' mothers and sisters and so on. And the young boys come out and throw stones at the tower. It's like throwing stones at Fort Knox, but they do it because they feel it's a matter of honor. And the soldiers kill them, sometimes with silencers and sometimes not. And Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, recorded it and saw it and told people. But it's something one is not allowed to say. I was on trial for many years in Scotland. I was on trial for anti-Semitism. On one occasion, it was for saying the words, "End the siege of Gaza." And that took 2 years in court for the sheriff to laugh, ridicule, and tell the prosecutor he was been wasting time at great expense. But it took a couple of years to see that off. But the other trial went on for 3 years for anti-Semitism, was because we went into a shopping mall and protested the Israeli Dead Sea Cosmetics people. In fact, we shut down every single Dead Sea Cosmetics place in the whole of Scotland. But the one we went into, 99 times you go in, it's fine, but this time they took out the handcuffs and we were taken away for a long weekend. And the food's terrible. And the charge was anti-Semitism, racially aggravated crimes. And the crime was, we had the placard is in there somewhere, it'll come up at a later stage, you can see it. But the placard said, this company profits from Israeli occupation. And there was a little blood symbol. This was in August 2014. It was 3 weeks after Operation Protective Edge. Israel only killed 2,200 people in that short operation. And the vegetable fridges in Gaza were full of little bodies. The blood was very recent, so we put a blood symbol on the placard. And in the court, after 3 years, the prosecutor said, that's really anti-Semitic. That's actually a sly, you might ask, that's actually a sly allusion to a medieval blood libel, where Christians used to malign, disgusting medieval maligning of Jews as kidnapping Christian children. It was horrible anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. And he suggested that was what we were really trying to say. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was preposterous. And it was thrown out very, very quickly. But it took a long time and a bit of silver and a lot of energy. And it was just it's harassment by the state. But during the discussion, the prosecutor presented evidence by an Oxford academic which said, basically, it's okay to talk about Israel killing children, because they do it. And it's also okay to talk about Palestinian blood, because there's quite a lot of it. But don't bang on about it, because if you do, that's anti-Semitic. And that, it doesn't make any sense, does it? You might think I've been smoking something, but I haven't been. That's what's happening now with allegations of anti-Semitism, and the new ones in the last few days that were all sort of terrorising MPs, right, by actually going there with an opinion. So it's part of attempting to shut down Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian voices. And Chris Hedges is a very significant journalist, and I think his opinion carries some weight. Rafah was the only place he'd ever been where children were killed for sport. It was the only place that had been recorded. And Iman al-Hams, her killing was recorded as well, and it's utterly horrific beyond words. But it should never have been recorded, and we should never know about it. But it's actually very common in the history of Palestine. Very common. Next picture, please. Yeah. This is the village I mentioned, Ain al-Zaytun. This is from 1948. These are Zionist militias marching the Palestinians away to be shot. A film taken at photographs taken at the time. That was a period of intense massacres. I mean, have you heard of Deir Yassin? Deir Yassin was I've been there, it's on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It's now a psychiatric hospital area. But all the people there were slaughtered by a man who later became Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. And he said it was just a miracle what happened after that Palestinians then fled in huge numbers. So I don't want to go on a bit, I want to end up with some optimism, but we should not think that anything began on October the 7th. That in October the 7th, Israelis suffered 75 hours of terror. Palestinians had suffered 75 years of terror and massacre after massacre after massacre. Next one. But you know, it's important here in Britain, in Scotland or in Bath, to understand how this came about. Because Britain prepared the ground. Britain nurtured the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement had tried to flog themselves to the German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, the Ottoman Pasha. Hey, support us and we'll be your people in the Middle East. And these other ones just were not so interested. But the British bought it. Yeah? The British bought the Balfour Declaration. And does anybody know Edwin Montagu? Anybody? Come on, you're starting for 5. Yeah, good. The honour of Bath is saved, right, by Hugh. The British voted for the British cabinet adopted the Balfour Declaration, giving Palestine to European colonists. Come and take it, we'll protect you. And the only person who voted against that was Edwin Montagu, the Jewish member of the British cabinet. He said, "Don't you tell me my future lies in Palestine. I'm English. I like it here. I'm Jewish by religion, but I have nothing in common with a Dutch or a French or an Indonesian Jew except my religion. We don't have a shared nationality. The idea is absurd." And by the way, when you tell me I have to move to Palestine, you're just encouraging the anti-Semites. You're just encouraging them. In fact, this is anti-Semitic, he said. The story of Edwin Montagu, it's worthwhile looking up Edwin Montagu. His critique of Zionism is quite interesting. It's an aristocratic one, but it's quite interesting. So the British, for people like Winston Churchill and folk like him, who were dyed-in-the-wool racists, very anti-Semitic, it was a win-win situation. You get rid of the Jews, whom they don't want, and you get a population in Palestine who become settlers and who are forced to rely on the British Empire for protection, and that link is very difficult to break. It's very important. I mean, I hate Zionism for two reasons. One, it's barbarism towards the Palestinians, and two, it says that I am an ineradicable racist, and all of you are ineradicable racists, and Jews cannot live safely among you, and must leave and go to another country and fall upon the Palestinians. They considered Uganda and Madagascar and Cyprus even, but they settled on Palestine. It's an insult to all of us. It's an absolute insult to say that we are so racist that Jews can't live among us. But also it serves the anti-Semites to turn Jews from being citizens living among us to becoming colonists on behalf of the British Empire. And that's, in fact, what has happened. This is a picture from 36-39. The Palestinians resisted. They had a revolution, 1936 to 1939, an independence struggle. It was crushed brutally by the British. The weapons of house demolition, collective punishment, assassination, which the Israelis were picked up and used, was taught to them by the British. The British, the skills that they had deployed across the empire, they passed on to their allies in the Zionist militias. This is just a little photo of a railway, and there's a couple of Palestinians in the front as human shields, because the vehicle may go over a mine. The Palestinians may be fighting back. So human shields were traditionally used by Israel, and it's another thing they picked up from the British. But the savagery of 1936-39 is very important to understand. 10% of the Palestinian male adult population was killed, injured, imprisoned, or exiled to Mauritius or Madagascar. That's a huge percentage of the population. They were crushed. And that's why, come 1948, when the Zionist terror gangs went out across the whole of Palestine to ethnically cleanse, the Palestinians were virtually defenseless. The job had already been done by the British and the Zionist militias in 36 to 39. So the Palestinians played a very minor role in the Nakba. They played a very important role, a very brave role, but a very minor role, really. They were beaten by 1939, for all intents and purposes, by the British. And the British record there is so savage. I read an article from the Journal of Imperial History, as one does, Imperial Military History, and the title was How the British Brutalised the Jewish Militias. Now, I thought, wait a minute, they were allies. Brutalise means I attack you and I brutalise you. No, they meant made them brutal. Made them brutal, right? Three heroes. Montgomery, he's got a statue in London, right? He went and did some service in Palestine. He carried out one particular massacre in the village of Bassa, and a local archbishop, an Anglican archbishop, a much nicer man than the creature who's the Archbishop of Canterbury now, this archbishop complained to Monty about the massacre. And he went away and he said, this man's just, to every question you ask him, his answer is always, I shall shoot them. The man is just blood mad, said the bishop. That was Montgomery. Another guy was Bomber Harris. My daughter here, her grandfather was a bomber pilot during the war. Right? terror bombing Dresden and various other places. Bomber Harris cut his teeth in the Middle East, in Iraq, occupied by Britain, and in Palestine. And Bomber Harris famously said, one 500-pound bomb dropped on a village that speaks out of turn will solve the problem. Britain terror bombed its way across Iraq and across Palestine as well. And that, it's important to know that. The third person who is a household name, not a household name, but very well known to historians, was Wingate, who founded the famous Chindits. He trained the Israeli militias in night fighting, in collective punishment, in assassinations, and all the dirty business of anti-colonial, of colonial warfare, which the Israelis gleefully picked up and have been using ever since. House demolitions, imprisonment without trial, torture, shootings, etc., etc. And, I'm not asking you to read Socialist Worker, but read the Journal of Imperial War History and you can find it's all there. Now, the problem is, it's all there from 70 years ago. What's happening this week is not in front of you. And I read the Israeli press, and Hebrew-speaking friends share stuff with me, and there's experts who share it. What I don't get, really, is in Israel, there is a lot of coverage of what happened after October the 7th, right? The Israeli soldiers killed a lot of Israelis. You know, there's the Hannibal Directive. Have you heard of the Hannibal Directive? Never allow an Israeli to be taken prisoner is the Hannibal Directive, even if it means killing the Israelis to prevent them becoming bargaining chips for the release of Palestinian prisoners. And the Hannibal Directive is not a conspiracy theory. It's part of Israeli common discourse, right? But the Hannibal Directive meant that on October the 7th, when Hamas and other fighters broke out of Gaza and captured a large number of Israelis, killed hundreds of soldiers and captured a large number of Israelis, Israeli tanks and helicopter gunships are reported in the Israeli press as incinerating large numbers of Hamas people and their captives. It's just there. Why is it not alluded to in the British media? Why? This is so disciplined, you know. It's so uncanny. You'd think somebody would mention it or talk about it. And maybe I've missed something and you have, but the demonization of people who fight against Zionists and against colonialism is amazing. Can I have the next picture, please? But there is good news. This character is called Doron Almog, and he's an Israeli general. And I can't remember the year. I've got my notes here somewhere. But when he landed at Heathrow, the Metropolitan Police were waiting for him with handcuffs. A British judge had issued an arrest warrant for, I think it was 2010, 2011. And lawyers for Palestinian human rights, or lawyers for Palestinian rights, had managed to get a judge to issue an arrest warrant. So his plane touched down at Heathrow, and he should have been arrested, of course. Does anybody remember Pinochet, the Chilean dictator? He was arrested in Britain for 6 months, and he was under terrible house arrest. He dined with Margaret Thatcher every month, even though he'd slaughtered thousands of Chileans. But so Pinochet got the treatment. Some honest judge put out an arrest warrant for him, and another honest judge couldn't possibly refute the evidence that was placed in front of him by lawyers and issued an arrest warrant for Doron Almog. Somebody tipped him off and his plane took off from London. Now, if the plane had had a Palestinian terrorist in it, they wouldn't have been allowed to take off, but he was allowed to take off and the arrest warrant was never issued. So even judges in this country recognize the compelling nature of the case that these people are war criminals. Next picture. Oh, by the way, he came to speak in Glasgow Hilton at a JNF fundraiser, and I was one of several hundred demonstrators there outside it. And this was earlier than this occasion. And he also fled on that occasion because he was told that there might have been another arrest warrant issued. This is Tzippi Livni. She came to speak at a Jewish National Fund meeting in London, except she didn't come because she was tipped off that an arrest warrant had been issued for her, and she cancelled the meeting and simply didn't come. And once again, a judge had looked into her record in Gaza and had issued an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I want to just say there is some good news. A previous Israeli ambassador to here, called Ron Prosor, he came to Edinburgh University and he was chased out. But before he left for the United Nations, he wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph, which is not part of my usual reading, but there's an article in there about our common democratic tradition. And in the article, Prosor says, and this is 15 years ago, he said, he compared Britain to a high-rise building, and he said, relations are wonderful in the penthouse. Relations with corporate Britain, with the government, with the Tory party, the Labour opposition, it's pretty good. We're getting on swimmingly. He said, every other level of the building is full of toxic anti-Israel hatred. He meant you. And what he meant was people know what's going on. They recognise there was a crisis. And he said, if this gets any worse, as in my opinion better, then it could pose serious questions for state-to-state relations. So if he was sounding the alarm that although things were fine in the penthouse, the problem was British public opinion. It was hostile and it was learned and it was informed to a degree that he didn't approve of. Next picture. Oh, I love this picture. You might ask why Joe Colombo, mafioso, has got anything to do with Israel-Palestine. Well, I think he does. Because this killer was under pressure from the FBI in the 30s, I think, and he founded the Italian-American Anti-Defamation Committee. And these mafia mobsters picketed the FBI to say, lay off Italian-Americans. Now, I love Italy. I've worked there for a while. I hate the mafia. Colombo was hiding behind the Italian people to protect the mafia. And the Zionists are hiding behind Jewish people to protect themselves. If you stand up to the crimes of Zionism and point out that it's inherently tending towards genocide and is now in full-fledged genocide, you're accused of being anti-Semitic. I have been, Jeremy Corbyn was, all sorts of people are. It's as old as the hills. You can despise the Ku Klux Klan without hating Christians. You can despise the mafia without hating Italians. And it's perfectly legitimate to hate Zionism, socialism, capitalism. You can hate any ism you want, right? It doesn't mean you hate a population. It's an ideology. But, you know, when people used to oppose the war in Iraq, the devastation of Iraq, what's his name, that cretin? What's his name? George Bush. This is anti-American. It's not anti-American, we hate you. It's not anti-American at all. I love Bob Dylan. I love Malcolm X. I love America. I was involved in a campaign against the war in Vietnam. And I remember what Americans achieved. I remember 10,000 GIs surrounding the Pentagon, shouting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. Right? Americans are capable of resisting their government to a great degree. The government's usually afraid of them. So to be anti-American is one thing. It's stupid. I mean, who doesn't like great music, the blues, excellent food? Anti-American, it makes no sense. To be against American militarism, that's something healthy. So there's Joe Colombo standing up for civil rights, human rights. He's a mafia hitman, yeah. And there he is, giving out leaflets and a placard around his, this is defamation of Italian Americans. The hell it is, right? It's hatred of the mafia. So be careful. Think of Joe Colombo when you're next accused of being anti-Semitic, right? It's just a human shield that's been used. Next one, please. God, I love this. I love this. I'm not a Christian anymore, but I think Muslims go to Mecca, don't they? And Catholics go to Lourdes. We should go to Dublin, to the Duns, the store where Duns women were on strike for 3 years. A woman, not a university professor, a woman in the checkout at Duns store refused to handle South African grapefruits. Her union had told her not to handle South African goods. They were on strike for 3 years because they refused to handle apartheid goods. Now that's just Dublin, it's just a little, who cares? Well, I'll tell you who cares. Shamelessly name dropping. I was talking to one of the Mandelas last week, and what was very important in South Africa was morale. The black liberation, the anti-apartheid movement was being crushed. It was the apartheid regime was brutal, and the military struggle against them was really on its uppers. And then, inside the prisons, the news came. In faraway Dublin, these women are out on strike on our behalf. And it tilted the balance even inside the prisons. The prisoners were more confident. The screws were thinking, wait a minute, I thought we'd won, but this could end up differently. It changed the balance of power. It gave heart, it gave succour to those people who were fighting against a racist regime. Any brown or black people here? Where I would be superior to them from the day I was born to the day I died. No matter how stupid or thick I was, no matter how brilliant they were, I would be superior to them. Just as in Israel, it's even worse, right? A Jew in Israel is superior to a non-Jew from the day they're born to the day they die. They have privileges that others cannot have. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who knows a thing or two about apartheid, said, compared to what the Palestinians are going through, what they went through in South Africa was, he said, a picnic. A picnic. The South African regime never bombed the Bantustans. It never declared a state of siege for 6 months, sometimes for a weekend. The horror visited upon the Palestinians. Think of the horror of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and then think that the people who went through that consider that in relation to the Palestinian life as a picnic. And that conveys what we're up against here. And not just since October the 7th, for the last 75 years. It's been truly... So these were the women who went out on strike and shifted things in South Africa. Look, we ran a campaign at Glasgow University. Come the election here in England, I think you're going to have to vote between a genocide party and a genocide party. But up in Scotland, we've got a choice. The Greens have... You've got Greens here as well, but the SNP have made they're quite good, actually. I was harshly critical of them, but they've come out for a ceasefire. They're talking about Israeli crimes, etc., etc. Glasgow City Council, by the way, all the parties except the Tories. Any Tories here? Probably not, because you all look very, very nice and human. But all the parties except the Tories, so all the humans really, have just voted to condemn the genocide and to make sure that Glasgow City Council does not in any way be complicit in that genocide, i.e. investments in pension funds for companies that supply arms. And in Glasgow City Centre, for the last 9 years, we have had an Israeli military-grade surveillance system in the city centre. A surveillance system which has facial recognition software, so it can clock you walking down Sauchiehall Street, but it's got emotional recognition software. Yes. This is public domain. We campaigned against it. We got it briefly into the mainstream media. So the council now is bound to look at any way in which it is inadvertently complicit in the genocide. Because let's be clear about this. The International Court of Justice found Israel faces a plausible case for genocide. Now, what does that mean? Once you use the word genocide, lots of things have to happen. And I think the British government is certainly considering what the hell's going to happen if Israel's found guilty of genocide and we were sending arms. Because the genocide legislation is extremely special, right? And it enjoins everybody to take action. Not just to prevent it, but if they think it's going to happen, to make sure it doesn't even start. So I'm very pleased with Glasgow City Council. It took a lot of pressure. The Greens finally moved, and they twisted the arms of the SNP and Labour, and nobody cares about the Tories anyway. We have to influence the morale. In a battle for existence, morale is everything. Morale is everything. Look, Algerians kicked out the French. 1 million died to get rid of the French from Algeria. When I was a boy, well, a youth, when I was a youth, I was told that Vietnam had invaded Vietnam and the Americans had to go and sort it out. And they killed 3 million people. 3 million Indo-Chinese. What's happening in Gaza is horrendous, but it's not unique. And it's not the first genocide that Britain has supported. How many people here know that Britain supported the Khmer Rouge? Does anybody know that? You don't even know that? Okay, go and check it. Prove me wrong. You won't. Britain and America supported the Khmer Rouge for years against the Vietnamese. Every year when the vote came up at the UN, who gets the seat? Either the Khmer Rouge that controlled 5% of the country, diamond mines, or the Vietnamese who controlled 95%. Year after year, Britain and America supported the Khmer Rouge at the UN. It's not something they boast about, but it happened. So complicity with... Look, if you can support the Khmer Rouge, who can you not support? Yeah? Who can you not support? Netanyahu's in the same league. So Britain has a long record of genocide. When I was a very young child, I was brought up to believe that there were savages. I'm sorry, any black people here. African savages were making life hard for these noble white people in Kenya. Now, today, nobody can deny the horror that Britain did in Kenya, the mass rape, the concentration camps, the killing. It's unspeakable. But nobody today would deny it. The savages were white, with black soldiers sometimes. And the black people there sort of resented people coming from another continent and taking all the best land. So they fought back. But I grew up on a diet of, I won't even mention it in this church. It's so disgusting what these black people did. They didn't. It was a lie. Every colonial people who struggle are demonized. Always. There's no exception. I grew up with, my name's Mick, but I still grew up with stories of thick paddies. Paddies were so thick and savage, stupid, right? The British were over there to civilise them as well. The anti-Irish racism there used to be shows that racism is not about skin colour. It's about geopolitical interests and anti-Irish race. No, you're not. Nobody here is as old as me. London B&B. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. That is a real thing. That's a real thing. So we know about the intense racism. We take it in with our mother's milk, in a sense, growing up in this society, against Africans, against Palestinians, against anybody that Britain's opposed to. So these people are truly wonderful. They're my heroes. Absolute heroes. Another one, please. Oh, this is the modern equivalent. Have any of you heard of Auckland Port? I wonder why you don't know about this. Auckland Port is the biggest port on the American Pacific. Okay? Biggest port. No Israeli ship has been able to unload there since 2014. Every time the ships go in there, they are forced out with their cargo on board. The dockers refuse to unload them. They fought for civil rights. They fought against South African apartheid. And now they're fighting against Israeli genocide. But since 2014, Israeli ships come in, they sail out, the cargo never comes off. It's wonderful. Never be anti-American. I love America. I love these Americans. And here's the thing. They tried again in 2021, and I just love it, you know. There was a picket of the dock by 1,000 people from the area, from Auckland. 1,000 people from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. And the longshoremen have a contract where they don't have to cross community pickets. So they just turned back and went away. From 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., another 1,000 people came from the community for a picket. This was mass involvement. Look, this is what we need to learn. This is what we need to aspire to. Israel can be defeated in its genocide. Not today. You can't stop the massacres they're planning at the moment. They will butcher children tomorrow. They'll empty another intensive care unit by killing everybody. They'll empty another neonatal intensive care unit by killing everybody. You can't stop that, because Britain has created a Frankenstein monster. And sometimes the Frankenstein monster bites Mr. Frankenstein or Dr. Frankenstein. If you train one of these XL bullies, it might bite you. Yeah? Now, Israel is involved in genocide, and these people in San Francisco, in Oakland, are taking amazing action on their behalf and have been doing that for years. Next picture. Oh, love this. Love this. My relationship to Hillary Clinton. It's time to reveal all. But it's important, actually. It's important that in 2003, we organised a campaign to get the Edinburgh International Film Festival to return money to the Israeli embassy. They had accepted money and they put their dirty logo on the programme. And we got a great campaign, a lot of people involved, and they returned the money. 3 years later, they did it again. As soon as our back was turned, they did it again, took 300 quid from the Israeli embassy in sponsorship money. And we got a great campaign, and we forced them to return the 300 quid to the Israeli embassy. The Israelis were spitting feathers, really spitting feathers. And then we thought that was it, move on to the next campaign. By the way, in the Edinburgh Festival, this is a film festival we're talking about, but in the Edinburgh Festival, there have been no Israeli performers since 2014. We always kick them out. When they turn up, we protest them. We don't think they should be involved. In fact, one group came called the Jerusalem Quartet, and I read on a magazine in Utah, of all places, that for them, their fans said, for these 4 musicians, 3 of them were immigrants, not immigrants, Zionists, they said, for these 4, a rifle in one hand and a violin in the other is the ultimate Zionist statement. And they boasted about that. We said, okay then, you're not putting your rifle down, picking up a violin and coming swanning around Edinburgh. We'll stop you. And we stopped them. We stopped them. So they haven't come back since 2014. But the film festival was a bit different. We just had a nice little campaign and then moved on. Hillary Clinton later, you'd have to be a real political nerd to know this, but she got into trouble by using her personal emails for state business. So a judge ordered her to publish thousands of emails. Whoa, that was interesting. That was interesting. What did we learn? The Scotsman newspaper ran a full-page article, and what the devil does that say? I can't even read it. But inside were the emails. We were a small campaign in 2009. Technical wizardry, it's amazing. We were a small campaign with an annual budget of probably 1,000 quid, meeting 10 of us in a church in Edinburgh. And we had a great campaign to force them to. And then we learn 2 multimillionaires in America were lobbying Hillary Clinton. Hillary, I went to college with Bill, we shared bunk. You must intervene in Edinburgh. These people are Nazis. This is dangerous. This could spread. It's all public. This could spread. You must intervene, Hillary. You must do something. I mean, we're talking about 300 quid. That's what she spends on a meal. And they were, they want you to believe that they're unflappable, that there's nothing you can do. You can't do anything. But underneath the surface, it's not quite like that. They're worried. And we got an inkling into how worried they were. Hillary Clinton set up an advisory group in the State Department to advise her how to defeat us in Edinburgh. And we are totally blissfully unaware of all this. We're never supposed to know. And the email say, Hillary, you must set up a group. Let's approach the London government and the Edinburgh government. They approached the Edinburgh government and said, none of our business. Don't even bother us. They approached the London government. God knows what they did. I don't know. But anyway, they failed. They failed, we won against the US government. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that even a small group of people who are organized and strategic and can see a vulnerability in their opposition, they can be effective beyond what you imagine you can be. But we have to organize. So I love that. It's one of my favorite stories. And I think we should end on a high note, because there are many people around the world. There's 1,000 Jews who occupied Central Station in New York in solidarity with the Palestinians. We occupy. I was thrown in the back of the police van a few weeks ago because we were having big demonstrations in Glasgow every week, of course, and the message came back: the cops are going to get heavy. And I was emceeing it, and the cops said, somebody said, the cops said, if you march, they're going to arrest people. And, okay, fine, let's see. And I said, look, the police said if anybody marches, they're going to be arrested. What do you think? Oh, march, march. I said, let's not. Sometimes you have to retreat. So let's retreat. I'm calling off the march. All of you go home now by train from Central Station. Go down there and buy your tickets together. You'll probably get a discount, because Scots like to get a discount, right? And we went. It was a brilliant march. It was a brilliant march, but buying tickets in a station is not a crime known to the law of Britain. And the cops were really hacked off. They were spitting feathers again. And they stood in front of the march and said, this is illegal, you can't do it. People just went round them and ignored them. Right? We have to get out of our comfort zone. Friends, this is genocide. This isn't just mass murder. This is genocide. And genocide means every single one of us has a duty to prevent it, to the limit of our abilities. Will we do it? Will we try? And by the way, I see there's a few people with grey hair. I would have grey hair if I still had hair. It's really important that you get involved. Because, you know, young people, if they break the law, if they want to be a social worker or a nurse or a doctor, I mean, they can't do it because they've broken the law. What can they do to us? What can they do? Am I worried about Monday morning, my boss? I'm not worried. There's nothing they can do. In fact, when the cops act up sometimes, on another occasion I was emceeing a demonstration in Edinburgh, the cop said, you can't go there. I said, yes, we can. No, you can't. Yes, we can. I said, okay, right, everybody, all the pensioners up to the front. And the pensioners all came up to the front, and we approached the police lines. And they partied like the Red Sea, right, against the Grey Panthers. So look, friends, this is very serious. I won't take up too much, because the main part of this is probably Q&A, yeah? To see where we agree and maybe even disagree. But I've never been so frightened in my life politically. I've been politically active for 65 years, 60 years. I'm scared. Not for me, but children, grandchildren. Some of the wee bums are going to make us a great-grandfather soon, I think. Worried about that. But it's not, look, it's really dangerous. You look into the heart, the eyes of Sunak, you don't see any pity. If they're capable of doing this, they are capable of anything. Anything. In your worst nightmare, they're capable of it because they've done it already. When Starmer says Israelis have the right to deny water to the people of Gaza, that's genocide. There's no other word for it. Now, if somebody comes to my door and says, I want your vote, we've got a good policy on street lighting or electric vehicles, I don't give a damn. The only issue is genocide. And if you're capable of genocide, I don't care what else you're capable of. You're not getting my vote. So I think something monstrous is happening at the moment. I think millions of people are traumatized, their hearts are bleeding, but they're also in unprecedented numbers prepared to take action. And we're finding people coming forward in unprecedented numbers. But if we don't succeed, look, they're burning Gaza, but they're also burning the planet. They're also burning the planet as if there was no tomorrow. You know, there may not be a tomorrow for a lot of people. So we're in a moment in the human adventure where, for the first time ever, utter horror is a distinct possibility on the horizon. I'm not talking about war between America and China, which is probable at some stage. That's another different thing. It's that when you know something, I'll just make a final remark. By the way, I've got a terrible weakness when speaking. I say that about 10 times, so just shout me down. You can't unknow something once you know it. And you know these people are hyenas, they're beasts in human form. They are monstrously immoral. And when I was a teenager, I got involved in a campaign against the war in Vietnam, of which I'm very proud. With millions of other people, we won. Yeah? We defeated American militarism. But I learned while I was doing that the Americans, they were doing all sorts of things. Massacring, exterminating villages, all sorts of things. But they were also producing tiny little bomblets, like about 5 times the size of an oxo cube. People remember oxo cubes? Brightly coloured, designed for children to pick up and blow their limbs off. And that was scattered across the land surface of Vietnam. It was open, it was discussed. And that was a strategy the Americans adopted to conquer that country. Now, once I knew that, how can you go back to normal life? I don't think you can. You have to understand that there's something terrible here. And when you look at what's happening in Gaza, the extermination of intensive care unit patients and neonates, and 500 people killed in a hospital where they were huddling in one bomb. Does anybody know, have you got a sense of what 400 meters is like? Israel has dropped over 200 2,000-pound bombs. Many other 1,000-pound. There's been more tonnage dropped in Gaza than Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. That, you can't even think of it that easily. But a 2,000-pound bomb shreds red-hot shrapnel over a circumference of 400 meters. And tomorrow, just map out, just walk for 400 meters and have a sense of what that is. 200 of them dropped in the most crowded place in the world. You can't unknow that. This is horror. This is horror. What can we do? We can join together. We can make a difference for sure. And the American poet puts it brilliantly. That's why you can't be anti-American. The American poet says, "Ain't nobody coming over a hill." She didn't say that, I said it. "Nobody coming over a hill." She said, "We are the people we have been waiting for." Don't wait for Starmer. Don't wait for anybody else. For the Palestinians not to be exterminated, only you are going to prevent that. And the Jews in Central Station in New York, and the young people climbing on the factories, arms factories, to smash them up. And the people who went into British aerospace in Govan last week and shut it down for a day. And the young people who will be on trial in Bristol for doing something similar. I hope you'll go and support them when they're on trial. And so on, and so on, and so on. But if we are not active, I don't mean hyperactive, I mean doing something. If we are not active, then as an atheist, all I can say in this nice church is God help us. Thank you.